The fight against Thalamus in Death's Gambit is an intense one. It's unlike any other fight in the game, and Thalamus himself just comes out of nowhere as it is. We've never heard his name mentioned before now, there are no tomes to find for him, and just look at him, he's huge. The battle is a struggle to survive, making the right decisions and avoiding traps, fighting minions with drained out health, and just trying to keep our heads on straight during an onslaught of confusion and chaos. When I fought Thalamus, I had no idea what was going on, and the fight occurred after a stretch of gameplay that was particularly difficult for me, and some story development that likewise weighed heavily on my thoughts and softened me up. I was deeply shaken, operating on panicked instinct and the need to survive. I kept striking out wherever I could, trying to find some sort of vulnerability, some way to hurt this enemy that saw me as nothing more than a helpless plaything. And I loved every moment of it. It's without a doubt my favorite boss fight in the game. But what is it? Who is Thalamus, and why is this fight such a strange one? That is exactly what I'd like to talk with you all about today. One theory is that the entire fight with Thalamus isn't really happening, and is just some sort of massive hallucination or bad dream. This theory does have a good amount of supporting evidence. Viewing the inventory screen during the battle shows that our location is listed as Nightmare. The item descriptions for all our items have changed to this garbled mess of letters, and our stat names have changed too. Since the part of the brain that creates dreams is on the opposite side as the part we use to read, it's said that it's more or less impossible to read in dreams. Even if you can make out words and letters, they likely won't make any sense, or you'll feel like you drew meaning from them without being able to actually see the words, as if you already knew what they were supposed to mean before you even tried to read them. This would explain why we can't read our item descriptions, and why our stats change to a message of self-doubt that makes zero sense in the context of a stat screen. Additionally, Thalamus is actually the name for a real part of the human brain. The thalamus is viewed as a sort of hub, relaying information between different parts of the brain, and it also plays a strong role in regulating one's sleep and wakefulness. It influences how alert you are when you're awake and what stage of sleep you're in, and if it's damaged, it could result in a permanent coma. Therefore, fighting a being called Thalamus could be interpreted as a battle against or within our own mind. Mechanically speaking, the way this fight plays out supports this theory as well. The whole fight is bizarre, with Soren being warped to different locations or his environment changing around him. Everything is dark, but we can see when we're standing on Thalamus' hand, or a stone platform with damaging energy beneath it. Otherwise, we're just standing on some unseeable floor in the pitch darkness, and the massive form of Thalamus watches us from a distance. We experience what do seem to be strong hallucinations during this fight, seeing copies of ourselves running and jumping around, or powerful enemies we fought in the past reappearing and striking us for 9,999 damage, causing us to die but then immediately pop back up. We even have a phase during this fight where we're back in our old home, reminiscing about things we see there. Once the fight ends, we suddenly reappear back where we were before entering mglw'nafh, with no new talent points, no shards, nothing to show we actually had a boss fight, except for the haunting laugh of Thalamus, almost like the final sound still echoing in our mind as we wake from a bad dream. After the battle, it's not possible for us to get back to mglw'nafh. How did we even get there in the first place? There are no paths or passages that lead there. Maybe we dreamt the whole thing. Death did warn us that our immortality put us in an unnatural state of flux, which would take a toll on us. Additionally, if we break the contract and become mortal, we never even go to mglw'nafh or fight Thalamus. This all suggests that the entirety of mglw'nafh and the struggle against Thalamus were some sort of hallucination or nightmare that occurred due to our decaying mental state as a result of our immortality, right?
Good guess, but actually no.
First of all, while we don't have anything to show for the Thalamus fight, there are unique items you can obtain in mglw'nafh. If that was all just a dream, where did we get them? If we were exploring some more normal area where we found those items, and we were just hallucinating the undersea city that was mglw'nafh, where was it? Why can't we find it again? Secondly, we see references throughout the game to mglw'nafh and Thalamus. The item description for the occult helm, sold by Fink near the beginning of the game, states, "Words are inscribed on the back. Suffer for mglw'nafh, so the world might be free." Such a place has never been mentioned in our histories or maps. Is this merely the work of a madman? The Eldritch Inquisitor in Journey's End also references mglw'nafh, saying she'll send us there on death. She's said to serve Thalamus, and even has a statue of Thalamus right there in the boss room. Endless also says, "Open your mind to him," during the battle against her. She's certainly not talking about death. She actively opposes him, and even tries to convince us not to trust him, saying, "How do you know he is who he says he is?" Endless is the highest authority we see in Cyrodiil. There's no king above her. So who could she possibly be speaking of aside from Thalamus, who, by the way, can be seen lurking in the background as we approach Endless, watching the events unfold? Given all of this, we can safely say that other characters in the game know about mglw'nafh and Thalamus, and we certainly did explore mglw'nafh. Unless Soren's mind did a lot of filling in of gaps, there's no way we just dreamed up mglw'nafh, and therefore it's extremely unlikely we just dreamed up Thalamus. If we had, why is that phase of the game the only time we have such vivid, complete hallucinations? Any other hallucination or dream we have is just a small segment, like a fragment of memory we recall between our death and rebirth. There is, in fact, a much more frightening explanation which explains things even more completely than the dream theory, and is what I believe is the truth. Thalamus is a Lovecraftian Great Old One, an ancient and super-powerful god from among a pantheon of beings who ruled the world eons ago. You've probably heard of Cthulhu, the most well-known and recognizable of Old Ones. What you may not know is that Cthulhu is only one of many, many godly horrors, and he's not even the most powerful. While the Cthulhu mythos is vast, encompassing many stories by several writers, the lore of Lovecraft is also referenced in several fictional stories outside of it. You've probably heard of Stephen King's It, with the creature known as Pennywise the Clown. It is actually a Lovecraftian Old One, and Stephen King's The Dark Tower series makes several references to Lovecraft as well. Ever played Bloodborne? The great ones in Bloodborne are almost certainly Old Ones as well, or at the very least are inspired by them, and many of the themes in Bloodborne are Lovecraftian in nature. My favorite book series, The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher, makes reference to Lovecraft too. One of the most dangerous and terrifying threats in the series is the Outsiders, foot soldiers and servants of the Old Ones who are barred from re-entering our reality. The Great Old Ones are terrifyingly powerful, and powerfully terrifying. Their true forms are so bizarre and vast that our minds literally cannot comprehend them, and actually viewing one in its true form would almost certainly render the viewer completely insane. It literally breaks our brain to try and comprehend what we're seeing when we look at an Old One. If you recall Stephen King's It, you may remember the deadlights. These lights are its true form, or at least the closest we can come to understanding it, and that's why when someone sees it, they go insane. Of course, Pennywise is on the weaker scale of things, and some of those rendered insane by seeing it were actually able to recover. In the new movie, one of the adults was simply snapped out of it, but just disregard that. That's not how it's supposed to work. As a result, when Old Ones do appear to us, they may take on several different forms, and they're often explained in such a way that their physical form makes no sense, like a writhing mass of tentacles and screaming mouths, or a flaming eye surrounded by countless floating hands. So, since we can't really know what an Old One looks like, what we see when we look at one is often a mix of what that being wants us to see and our own interpretation of it. Many are also known to be shapeshifters, once again, like Pennywise, who could read minds and take on the form most terrifying to its victim. Pennywise can even alter reality and induce hallucinations, but only for those who are open to it. Pennywise cannot harass or harm those outside of its influence, and any changes it makes to reality are not felt by those fortunate souls. These traits are not uncommon among Old Ones. Old Ones can have several names and titles, and there's no shortage of secret cults who worship the Old Ones as gods. They are known to bestow gifts upon their worshippers, such as the people of the fishing town Innsmouth receiving all the fish and gold they wanted in return for human sacrifices made to the Old Ones Dagon, Hydra, and to a lesser extent, Cthulhu. Those most honored and worthy worshippers of Shub-Niggurath, Mother of 1,000 Young, were said to be consumed and then regurgitated as a higher being, one with immortality. Being extra-dimensional beings, going to an Old One can sometimes mean crossing into a different dimension or opening a gate to a world on the other side of the universe, and the meeting is not always something that happens in a physical way. You may meet them in what seems to you to be an incredibly detailed dream, but what is really closer to your consciousness and will being temporarily drawn to a whole other reality. Now, you may be wondering, if these Old Ones are so great and powerful, how come they used to rule? Why don't they still rule now? Why are there only cult groups who worship them instead of entire countries? The answer to that is both simple and complex, but the short version is that they are no longer part of this reality that you and I are experiencing. Many are dormant, sleeping as though dead until they are disturbed. Some are actually locked out of our reality, trapped in another dimension, and only able to peer in when mortal beings summon them or worship them. Some just don't care about us anymore and have moved on to other things. Remember, it's a big multiverse, and Earth is just one small, mildly interesting planet in it. All of this brings us back to Thalamus. We know Thalamus is a giant, immensely powerful dark being with an anatomy that makes no sense. Triangle shoulder mouths? Eyeless sockets on his face, but open rolling eyes on his hand and arms? We know that Thalamus has the power to mess with our head and alter reality, and seems more interested in toying with us and breaking our spirit than he is in killing us outright. We know Thalamus is worshipped as a deity, and the Eldritch Inquisitor, essentially the religious leader of Cyrodiil, would imprison and torture people in Journey's End, like living sacrifices of pain and suffering in Thalamus' honor. The people of Alduin were judged worthy of immortality by their faith, and only the most faithful and deserving among them were granted immortality, which we see in Journey's End and Il'noth how that worked out for them. Oh, and that garble we see on the item description screen during the battle? That's not garble. That is actually a language spoken by those who worship the Old Ones in the story The Call of Cthulhu. It was translated by Reddit user Barbie Carstreams with the help of their Discord, and seems to say, "Wait dead, all a dream. Il'noth essence pit not, or wait in home R'lyeh, home wait waits." R'lyeh, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, is the name of an ancient sunken city beneath the ocean, and is the prison where Cthulhu sleeps. Just like Il'noth is a sunken city at the bottom of the ocean, where we encounter Thalamus. Being a great old one, Thalamus isn't physically present in our reality, but he's aware of what's happening in it. He knows Soren personally, we can tell from his taunting. However, it's only when we're in this state of flux between life and death that we can perceive him and be threatened by him directly. Those who are truly alive or truly dead are both out of his reach, and it's only when that natural order is defied that he has an opening. Do you see what I'm getting at here? The Thalamus boss fight doesn't just happen out of nowhere. Thalamus is the true primary antagonist of the game. Thalamus is a great old one, a powerful god from beyond the walls of our reality who, as a treacherous gift to his worshippers, gave them the source of immortality. Much like the town of Innsmouth, the influence of the Old Ones has driven Cyrodiil into a state of decay and despair. The spreading immortality not only creates more victims for Thalamus' servants to torture, but also spreads his influence in our world. The battle against Thalamus isn't a physical struggle. No human with mere mortal weapons could ever hope to actually win against an old god like Thalamus. Instead, my belief is that what we see and experience is a struggle occurring in multiple dimensions, a living nightmare. Thalamus causes us physical pain, mental hallucinations, and with his taunts and whispers, is trying to bend us to his will. He highlights dark, negative thoughts and emotions to try and smother our will and enthrall us. We fight back by holding on to the hope we carried with us since we were young that we would find and rescue our mother, and by latching on to positive emotions such as loyalty and perseverance, taking them as sources of strength in our struggle. Thalamus appears to be melting as the fight goes on, but this isn't because we're hurting him. Rather, this is our visual interpretation of the Old One's grip on us weakening. We're escaping his grasp, resisting his will, and clinging to our memories that define who we are, and eventually, we prevail. Thalamus isn't defeated or destroyed, but we did resist him, and prevented him from turning us into one of his twisted servants. We resisted losing our minds and ourselves, and returned to our own world intact. Just like Death hoped we would. After all, the title of this game is Death's Gambit. A gambit is defined as a device, action, or opening remark, typically one entailing a degree of risk that is calculated to gain an advantage. Death's goal here is not just to restore the cycle of life and death because things are supposed to die. Death is actively opposing Thalamus, and doing so with an immortal champion of his own. If Death's Gambit succeeds, the cycle of life and death is restored, and Thalamus is locked away from our realm more completely, at least until some crazy cultists start getting ideas in their heads again. This game is truly about the entity known as Death opposing an invading Old One named Thalamus, who is using immortality to twist and harm our reality, torture mortals, and eventually rule the entire planet. We're just the weapon he employs to do it, and I don't think we're the first one who tried. I think there was at least one other person whom Death made a deal with. One other who became immortal, fought their way into Cyrodiil, and who was captured and imprisoned by the Eldritch Inquisitor. I think that person was tortured and had their will broken, and that, unlike Soren, they were not successful in resisting the will of Thalamus, becoming his slave and enacting his will under a new name. I think Everly was supposed to be Death's champion, but she wasn't able to resist Thalamus, and became his greatest servant. Endless. The final battle of the game is Death's champion, Soren, who resisted the will of an Old One, against Death's fallen champion, who was broken and enslaved. And in that sense, we're not just saving our mother from the curse of immortality. We're fighting to free her from the grip of a horror beyond reality, beyond comprehension, beyond even mortal imagination. And that horror is Thalamus.